Hi, everyone. As I said, my name is Alex. I'm Director of Influencing and Engagement here at NCVO. And thank you for joining today's voluntary sector briefing for key information for charities and particularly for volunteering involving organisations during this period of national mourning. We're joined today also by Daniel Flusky, Director of Policy and Communications at the Chartered Institute of Fundraising. And so we're really thankful that he's able to join us to add in some additional insight on fundraising into today's session. Before kicking off, I want to acknowledge that we are recognising through this week the loss of our patron of the last 70 years, Her Majesty the Queen. And we celebrate Her Majesty's service to UK civil society in the UK, but also around the world. And I'm incredibly thankful for the support that she offered to charities and volunteering throughout her lifetime, and that of the royal family as well. Today's session is intended to help staff, leaders, trustees, volunteers understand what's going on through this period of national mourning, and outline some of the considerations that we think charities should have in mind, both as we kind of collectively navigate the days ahead, particularly the days up until the funeral, state funeral on Monday, but also some things in the weeks ahead and perhaps months ahead, both as things return to kind of normality, but also some things that will need, charities will need to be thinking about that will take a few months to come through. In terms of kind of housekeeping for today, you'll notice that there are closed captions. These are subtitles. These have been enabled and should be appearing on your screen at the moment. You can turn these on or off using by clicking a little icon on your Zoom bar that says CC, closed captions. One of my fantastic colleagues, Sophie, I think has just added in a PDF version of the slides that we're presenting. That's in the chat box at the moment. And so you can see all the slides that we're going to present kind of by downloading that file there. We will also be sending an email to all participants later this afternoon, and that will also include the slide deck as well. This is a webinar format. And so although today's briefing, as I said, is being recorded, the only people who are visible with their cameras and microphones on are those of us who are presenting. No one else can. But as you'll see in the chat functionality, that is open and accessible to all people who are listening in to the webinar today. I'm sure you're here because you might have some questions. We will have time for some Q&A towards the end of today's session. Please use the Q&A functionality. So again, on your Zoom taskbar, there is two kind of speech bubbles that say Q&A. Use that functionality to kind of log any questions, and we'll come to those questions towards the end. Alternatively, you can put questions in the chat box as well, and either wait for someone from our team to answer, or you might be able to help each other answer questions as well. This is only a short 45-minute session at maximum. We won't be having any breaks at all, but we may indeed finish a little bit earlier as well. So the agenda that we're going to run through today is we're going to start today's session just by outlining some of the immediate timeline and key events that are happening, particularly over the next kind of 10 days. We'll then talk about the kind of campaigning and political environment and some key things that people should be considering. We'll then talk about a series of kind of components, I suppose, of kind of organizational life. So we'll spend some time thinking about events and operations, then think about fundraising, then managing communications, and finally kind of supporting the well-being of staff, volunteers, and kind of beneficiaries as well. And then, as I said, at the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers. And again, please do use the functionality for Q&A there as well. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Chris, who's going to talk to us both about the timeline for the next 10 days, but then also how this is implications for kind of campaigning and the wider political environment. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So yeah, we thought it would be just useful to sort of give people a steer on, particularly the weekend, but as Alex is a bit longer. So first point is, and you may have seen some of this happening, is firstly, the king was proclaimed as king at the weekend, and is now in the middle of visiting each of the UK nations. So he was in Scotland yesterday, is in Northern Ireland today, and will be in Wales on Friday. While this is happening, we are building towards the lying in state of the Queen. So her coffin was in Edinburgh yesterday, and is now sort of on the way to London. So from tomorrow evening, she'll be lying in state, and that will be until the morning of the funeral. So I think 6:30 a.m. On the 19th. So I think most of the focus as we go forward this week will be on Monday, when we have the state funeral, and also the bank holiday as well. It's worth saying, as it might sort of come up in discussions, that we're in the national mourning period at the moment. Once we've had the funeral, we'll then enter the royal mourning period. This doesn't have so many implications for charities. It's largely about the royal family continuing, and those associated with the royal to continue with the mourning process. The only thing would be there are some questions around sort of the use of public buildings, so it might just be being aware of that as well. And then I think the big thing to say, and we'll sort of go on with this as we start to talk about campaigning, is that this week will just be a lot of the media focus and coverage is on that sort of process, the visits, and building up to the state funeral. And so yes, so as we're kind of in that process, we know that a lot of the kind of formal official business of Parliament and government has stopped. So Parliament is not sitting at all this week. We are expecting it to return next week, possibly for only one day, on the Thursday, the 22nd. And it's possible, or we think is actually quite likely, that will be the day when we have the sort of planned fiscal event that was suggested when the Prime Minister made the announcement on energy last week. In terms of party conferences, so Liberal Democrats have cancelled their conference, as it did coincide with the funeral. We do expect that Labour and Conservative conference will still go ahead. I don't think I've seen a sort of official announcement, but that is what we expect. And there's also some speculation that the conference recess, which was due to end on the 17th of October, that might be brought forward a week, so that we don't lose a week in the parliamentary calendar, particularly considering sort of all of the big issues that are going on in Parliament at the moment. The other big impact that we've seen is the reshuffle has been paused. So there will be some roles that aren't filled. There will also be some people who are still in post from the last government, and that's the case for the Civil Society Minister. He's our sort of main minister, Nigel Huddleston. I would expect that that will restart in the days after, and being completed actually in the days after the funeral. So we'll watch out for that. And then I think the big question, I think, in terms of campaigning is what is appropriate and useful to do this week. Certainly there aren't sort of any formal restrictions. So I think if you are doing kind of time-sensitive campaigns, then it makes sense to kind of go forward with those. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that as a lot of people's minds are sort of elsewhere, particularly things like media coverage, lots of focus there, that it might be better to postpone some things if you haven't already. And then probably the other thing just to say is, obviously a lot of people will be writing to the new government. I don't think there are any problems with doing that this week, but we have decided that we're going to hold off until next week, when we think things should be pretty much back to normal in terms of responding to correspondence and normal government business. So yeah, I think those are the key things. So back to Alex.
Chris, thank you very much. We're now going to go to Amy, who is going to tell us, which we think there's probably quite a number of questions that we've had already around events and kind of charitable activities, and what's the best approach for our events and operations. Amy, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so looking at things from a practical perspective, things you might need to consider around events and operations. So it's worth noting that there's no obligation to suspend business or to cancel or postpone events during the national mourning period, but you should make sure to refer to the official guidance. And there are, however, various things you may want to consider when making the decision about whether to postpone or cancel anything you've got planned. So thinking about the nature, location, tone, and content of your planned event, depending on the nature and location of your organisation and the tone of planned events, this might lead you to consider cancelling an event. And it's important to note, however, that this is at your organisation's discretion. You'll need to consider any costs associated with cancelling or postponing events and whether you need to consult with any partners on this. Think about the event attendees and how the news might have affected them and whether in turn that might affect your event attendance. And if events are to continue, as a mark of respect, you might want to consider, in keeping with the tone of national mourning, holding a period of silence or perhaps playing the national anthem at the start of events. And if you've planned meetings with MPs, ministers, government officials, as I think Chris touched upon there, you might want to reach out and see if these are still going ahead. It's likely that they'll be cancelled, at least within this immediate period. Thinking about your charity's connection to the monarchy. So if the Queen or a senior royal is a patron, you might want to cancel events and reduce your activity out of respect. And you should also check to see, particularly for royal charities, or if you do have a senior royal or the Queen as your patron, whether you have any protocol that you need to follow at this time. Think about travel in your local area. So certainly public transport in key locations will be very busy and journeys may take longer than usual. We expect that further information will be announced by network operators, but make sure if your event is going ahead, asking your attendees to check their journey ahead of time, and thinking about whether this might also affect event attendance and weighing up all of those factors in making your decision. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, thinking about your staff and volunteers. So staff and volunteers may respond differently to this news and may experience a range of different feelings. And this might mean that your staff and volunteers request time off for personal reflection, private mourning, or perhaps to attend the Queen's lying in state. And this might affect your organisation's ability to deliver on planned events.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Amy. And certainly we know that the work of many charities will simply carry on, particularly those who are supporting people, delivering services and support. But thanks, Amy, for the things that we must be considering at this time. We're now going to, as I said, this webinar, we're joined today by Dan Flusky, Director of Policy and Communications at the Chartered Institute of Fundraising. Dan, great to have you with us. What's your advice for kind of fundraising specifically?
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and thank you for the opportunity to join you for this session, and great to see NCVO put this on for because obviously an area that lots of organisations and charities are wanting to make sure that they approach this in the right way. So a lot of what I was going to say, I think kind of Amy has covered bits actually, because a lot of the same kind of considerations that organisations would be having in relation to their events is also appropriate to fundraising as well. Last Friday, we worked with the fundraising regulator to prepare guidance for the sector about what to do in relation to fundraising. This is more advice guidance rather than regulatory guidance. So I think, as Amy said, there is no regulatory or legal reason why you need to cancel a fundraising event or a fundraising activity or campaign that you have. So this is less about can I do it, it's more about should I do it and is it right for us to continue? And that requires some careful consideration. But what it also means is that some organisations might take different responses to others. And I think we have to be mindful of the fact that everyone's trying to get this right, but what right looks like might be different for different types of organisations, and not to kind of say, well, they're doing that, so they're wrong because we're doing that and we're right, because there will be different types of factors to think about what's right. In terms of considering things, I would urge that, recommend rather, that you look at this as a whole and across your organisation. So if you're an organisation that's doing campaigning, doing events, doing fundraising, try to have an overall approach that is consistent, rather than one of your teams going over there and doing this and one of them going over there and cancelling that. And that consideration should be informed through discussions with senior leadership and potentially with trustees as well, so that there is a common approach and you know what you're doing. And importantly, so that if you were to maybe get any feedback or complaints perhaps about why you chose, and you can share the reasoning behind why your organisation has done this and show how you were trying to do this in a sensitive and appropriate way. We've seen some fundraising continue. So, for example, on Sunday, there was the Great North Run that took place. And obviously, a lot of people train for that and fundraise for that. Now, the amount of fundraising that happened on the day was different from previous years, but the event did take place. So for organisations that are running events, you can see there is some precedent for continuing to do it. And obviously, that's to do with kind of, is it appropriate to do it? What's the kind of scale of the impact if we chose not to, in terms of how many people have trained and taken part? So it really does depend. It's not one right answer. You mentioned about the fact that some charities have got a royal patron. I've seen Great Ormond Street and British Red Cross, for example, have put up two charities where the Queen was patron, has put up opportunities on their homepage of their website for people to donate in memory of the Queen, which is appropriate for them as organisations that have had that royal patron. But what they're not doing is plastering that over social media. So it's kind of, if people were to find it through going onto that website or knowing that there's that association, they have that opportunity to show generosity and support and in memory. And I guess that's the kind of tone and sensitivity you're looking for in terms of public feedback. It's, would this feel or look like it is being disrespectful or opportunistic? And if it is, I would urge caution and row back from it. If it is day-to-day activity, I would imagine you can pretty much continue, but a lot of organisations will be taking the quiet approach for now and pausing things where they can and where it isn't disrupting stuff. The other thing to think about is just what's the type of fundraising. So, for example, if you had an email that was being planned to go to supporters this week about your new legacy campaign, I would probably suggest pausing that until after next Monday. At the Chartered Institute, we run a week called Remember a Charity Week, which happened last week, which was all about promoting gifts in wills to charities. So there was a week-long campaign, social activity, national TV opportunities about talking about gifts in wills to charities. And we cancelled what we had planned for the Friday because it wouldn't have been appropriate for us to be talking about, have you ever thought about leaving a gift to your charity in your will on that day? So that's the kind of thing that was appropriate to postpone and to cancel, but other things wouldn't be. So I would suggest, if you had any kind of legacy campaigns, trying to probably look at how you could reschedule those. if you were having any events that were being planned for next Monday now, either if that was public fundraising, which might be people fundraising in a public place, approaching people for direct debits in a town square or door to door, that a lot of organisations will be pausing that and not doing anything on the day of the funeral. But in the main, it's about consideration of appropriateness and sensitivity. Think about what the public would respond to. Think about what's the public's mood. Think about whether it's going to be good fundraising to actually reach people with those messages at that time. But as I say, it's not a hard and fast rule. All charities must do this. All charities should cancel that, or all charities can go ahead. It's about carefully consider the activity, think about what's right for your organisation, think about what's right for your supporters to hear those messages at that time, and to take a joined up approach across the organisation in line with the other areas that we're covering on this session today. The links, I think, have been shared, that guidance in the chat, and will be available afterwards. And I believe I hand back to Alex.
You do. Thanks so much, Dan. As Dan just said at the end, the link to the kind of joint statement and all of the advice kind of from the Chartered Institute of Fundraising and the fundraising regulator has been posted in the chat box. It's also in the links in the document in the PDF that we've put in the chat box as well, and will also be in the slides we'll share later. I think the key message that I would take both from what Amy and Dan have both shared there, which I know has been reassuring to members and charities that I've spoken to in the last week, has been the difference between can I and should I. I think some charities were really concerned, thinking they would have to cancel all the things they currently had planned. Absolutely not the law, not the requirement, but you should be considering both what's appropriate, but actually, I think as Dan said there, what's going to be most effective for the purpose, whether that's fundraising or whether that's other types of events, and keeping that kind of in mind. We're now going to move on, and I'm going to lead this section just talking about kind of how to manage kind of communications at this time. And for most of the things I'm going to talk through here, it's mostly about kind of external communications, though I will touch a little bit on how to communicate internally, perhaps with staff and volunteers and service users as well. So I think, first of all, it's just worth acknowledging, I'm sure we all feel it, but major news just creates a huge amount of kind of noise. And I would say at the moment, with the number of events that have just happened in the last week, with a change of government, change of prime minister, with the death of Her Majesty the Queen, with big events happening in Ukraine, then it can feel for people trying to absorb news and communications, whether that's through traditional media or whether that's in their inboxes, whether that's in messages on social media, it can feel a lot and can feel overwhelming. So our advice is, again, similarly to others, certainly not to stop communications, but to prioritize what's really essential that you communicate with your audiences, whether those are service users, whether they are supporters, or people that you're working with or alongside. And that's mostly just on trying to limit the amount of things that people are going to receive, so that really you maximize the chances of your message, of your comms being heard and hopefully actioned, presumably. That's why you're communicating with people, because you want them to know something or to do something with that. So what's effective in terms of that? I think we always go back to this. It's always, I mean, some of this is simply just good communications anyway, but really focusing on who are your users and what do they need to know, but also what's your organizational purpose. So if you are a service delivery organization and you're continuing to deliver services, say mental health support over this week, well, I imagine that if you're communicating with service users, that's going to be an essential communication. They're going to need to know their appointment or how things have changed because of events this week. So that kind of thing, if it directly links to what you're there to do and people really need to know it, absolutely go ahead and prioritize those communications. If there are non-time sensitive things, kind of other campaigns that you might be running or other announcements that you'd hope to make this week, but that aren't necessarily time sensitive, don't have to happen this week, you might want to consider moving them to another time so that, again, you've got most chance that your messages will be heard by their audience. One of our kind of tips, I suppose, here is to make sure that you reviewed your scheduled communications. So if you've got tweets or Facebook posts planned in 2 weeks in advance, for example, you might need to check that to make sure you don't inadvertently say something either that's kind of inappropriate or could potentially kind of damage or cause offence in the reputation of your organisation particularly. So review that and be mindful. In terms of internally, I think, again, some of our own challenges, even at NCVO, is just making sure all of our own staff and our kind of leadership, trustees, just know what's going on. When there's an awful lot going on in the world, helping people navigate it, even if it is simply repeating information and making sure that people kind of hear things. So let people know your organizational plans, let people know about whether you're closing on Monday, what services you're continuing to provide, how you're working is really, really important. Finally, as we will touch on in the next section on well-being, this week will have thrown up huge emotions for many people. And throughout this time, I think our general message is to kind of communicate both internally and externally with care, with empathy, with kind of acknowledgement of the range of emotions that people might be feeling, both directly and indirectly linked to the death of the Queen. And so just bear that in mind as you're communicating with people over the next week. In the chat box, we've put some links to Charity Comms, one of our kind of infrastructure partners as well, who've got some excellent advice on communicating in a crisis in general, but particularly pertinent to this week. The final section that we're going to talk through now is supporting mental health and wellbeing. And for this, I'm going to pass back to Amy.
Thank you, Alex. And I think Alex has touched upon a bit of this already in terms of internal communications. But as he's quite rightly said, your staff, volunteers, and those you work with may need extra support and reassurance during this time. I think it's important to note that reactions to the Queen's death are deeply personal. Everyone will experience different emotions, sadness, anger, apathy, whilst many will be feeling deeply sad at the loss of such a constant figure in our lives. For others, it may trigger memories of personal bereavement, for example, and consider what this means for your staff, volunteers, and beneficiaries. Different communities will need support for different reasons at this time. For some, it may trigger feelings related to how they were impacted by the history of the monarchy. And for others, as I've said, the loss of a constant figure may be very painful, particularly for older generations who've lived through much of the Queen's reign. I think it's important to acknowledge this and let staff, volunteers, and beneficiaries know the kind of support that is available, be that from within your own organisation or from external sources. Many organisations for subsectors of the charity sector have released useful guidance on this, for example, such as how to speak to children about this. And I think somebody put a really useful resource in the chat a little bit earlier on. So hopefully going to compile a few of those as well and send those out as well. Respect the different views that we all hold and consider what this might mean for your beneficiary group. You might want to consider reaching out directly to those who may be particularly impacted, especially those who may be socially isolated or digitally excluded at this time and may need some extra support in that way. I think it's really important that you make space for conversations within your organisation and create the right environment for mental health and well-being. Creating a culture of understanding and openness can help everyone in an organisation. So leaders and managers should make sure that staff and volunteers know that their well-being matters to them. Try to talk openly about the importance of mental health and well-being in meetings such as this or in internal staff meetings, and provide information to staff and volunteers about mental health and wellbeing and the support available. Trustees and senior staff should support line managers and volunteer managers to have conversations, check-ins with their staff and volunteers about mental health and wellbeing. During the national mourning period, many communities will organise events commemorating the life and service of Her Majesty, and staff and volunteers may want to participate in these. They may also wish to pay their respects by attending the Queen's lying in state. So you may need to allow them time off to do this. Try to be flexible, and as Alex has already said, try to clearly communicate your organisation's plan and approach as soon as you can. This time can be very disorientating, and I think having clear information is really helpful for your staff, volunteers, and indeed your beneficiaries as well. Here at NCVO, we've got lots of resources for supporting mental health and wellbeing in your team, which I think somebody's going to put in the chat just now, the link to our webpage on that. But you should also make sure to refer to your mental health and wellbeing policy. And if you don't currently have one of those, we've got resources to kind of help you put one of those together as well. That's all from me. Back to you, Alex.
Great, thanks so much, Amy. So we'll now move into our Q&A session. We have, I think, a couple of questions already, but if you have any questions from anything we've presented so far, please do put them in the chat box and also in the Q&A function. Just also to thank those of you who've also been adding in additional links and signposting to other resources, particularly Sally there and Stephen, thank you very much for adding those in. It's really appreciated. There's a lot of really excellent guidance actually out there, and much of what our advice today pulls and draws upon lots of the things that we've been seeing and reading over the last week. So the first question, which I'm going to kind of respond to, is, do we know yet any protocols for charities awarded the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service? And are we still able to use the logos? So as far as I know, there's no official protocols yet. We would expect kind of guidance to follow from Buckingham Palace, particularly around the use of logos, and kind of particularly those also with royal patronage as well would kind of be in this kind of box as well. So we've not seen that guidance yet. So we do expect that to follow, but our suggestion would be to continue using these things as you have until told otherwise. Once we do see any of that advice, we'll be sure to make sure that people know about it, and that's highlighted to people as well. Let me just look at, we've had a flurry of questions come in at the kind of last couple of minutes. Just to the NCVO team and to Dan, I'm probably just going to run quickly through some of these. So if I come to you, we haven't had too much time to allocate them amongst ourselves. So please do just to the NCVO team and to jump in. So the next question was, the Queen was our patron. Where will I find more information about taking this reference off our website and stationery? Again, I think I might go to Chris in a moment on this, but I think we would expect advice if the Queen was a patron. We would expect advice to come from Buckingham Palace in the weeks ahead, probably not this week, with advice for kind of former royal charities or organisations where there is a royal patron. First of all, obviously around kind of actions that those charities might need to take in terms of referencing the Queen or styling the Queen in written communications, or use of portraits or logos, or kind of styling it, the kind of association, but also because patronage may well change in the future. So royal patronage doesn't necessarily pass to His Majesty the King. There will be, in the months ahead, I would expect some realignment and resorting of royal patronages across the charitable sector. And actually that was another question that I think I've answered there. Do we think royal patronages will be reallocated in due course? Yes, I expect they will. We already saw in His Majesty's first remarks as king and the acknowledgement that he would be stepping back from his many kind of charitable duties, but the expectation would be that some will take their place. But yes, there will be some alignment. Having a quick look at the questions here. So the next question, have we got a sense from across the non-profit sector on kind of the restarting of active campaigns? And Chris, do you have anything you want to add here on kind of political campaigning, and when might we expect to see kind of campaigning returning? Chris?
Yeah. Sorry, thanks, Alex. Yes, so I think I would think after the or the day after the funeral, I think is probably when we'll start to see organisations, and partly I think if we look at next week, yeah, we'll be going to the party conference season, but also we're expecting Parliament to return, and we're expecting a fiscal event. So I certainly think that organisations campaigning on costs will want to say something ahead of that event. So again, like all of the things that were said earlier by Alex, Dan, Amy, there is an element, I think, of judgment, of tone and appropriateness, but I think we'll be certainly getting towards normal campaigning next week once we're the day after the funeral and beyond.
Thanks very much, Chris. The next question I'm going to come to Dan. So if an appeal mailing is due to be posted and emailed next week, would you suggest pausing for a bit longer, or do you think we should go ahead?
I think kind of similar to that. I mean, I think kind of over the course of next week, you will see things kind of getting back to normal. I would, if you had an email that was being planned to go on Tuesday morning, for example, I'd probably say leave it a couple of days if there's nothing critical in there, which means it has to go on that Tuesday. And just check what that appeal is, and the kind of the tone of it and how you're presenting it, and whether that feels jarring, given that would be a day or two after the funeral. Again, there is no reason that you would have to pause it or have to cancel it, but just review it and give a common sense bridge. And if you're finding it hard, because sometimes it is hard when you're really not sure, pick up the phone, have a chat with somebody that's not in your team, and just say, we've got this planned. What do you think? If you were to receive that, how would that feel by you? Get a couple of kind of sense checks back, because that can be really helpful. Sometimes you can kind of get stuck in a little bit of a tunnel of uncertainty when you're kind of a little bit paralyzed and not really sure in which way to go. Get a couple of people to have a sense check of it. As I say, I probably wouldn't do something kind of immediately on that Tuesday morning. Towards the middle and end of the week, I think you will see things kind of returning to business as usual. Thanks very much, Dan. I'm going to pick up one of the questions on kind of social media and kind of communications. So this question is, the Queen was our patron, and we've paused all social media activity. We'll pause this until after the funeral, but wanted to sense check that posting anything political, and in quotes, on social media, for example, on cost of living, is not advised until after the funeral. I think on so the Queen, I can talk from our own experience, some of the considerations we have made at NCVO. The Queen was also our patron as well. We have paused, we've gone quieter. I would say we haven't kind of paused all social media activity, but we are probably being slightly more selective and prioritizing particular messages that we want to amplify and share. I think we have decided, for example, we will continue to do some external communications on actually the cost of living, because we have a new page going live this week to support charities through with the cost of living and to give some advice. And we took the decision that we thought that was really important
because charities were struggling now with that work. And so in terms of support, we thought that was really important and useful. But as I said in my bit of the briefing, if there was kind of important but not necessarily urgent communications, we've probably tried to shift that a little bit into next week to be slightly quieter, both I think as a mark of respect, but also just acknowledging that there will be a lot of communications to lots of people at this point. And so we're just wanting to make sure we're prioritizing and getting those key messages out there. I think in terms of the kind of more political work, whether that's kind of lobbying or influencing or campaigning, I think linking together some of the things that both Dan and Chris have said, we do expect this to kind of come back pretty quickly next week, particularly as parliamentary business kind of resumes. But there is, of course, some urgency around the kind of cost of living crisis, both because our communities are facing that crisis, but also because we know that there are major political announcements likely. And so I think we are being more mindful about the mechanisms and how we are getting that message out there. So we might be continuing to work with officials who are still working with us on there, but we might not be communicating to all MPs, for example, mostly because we don't think it's a particularly effective influencing strategy at this point, because we think their minds are going to be elsewhere. So again, there's no hard and fast rules on some of this. It is judgment calls, which I think does make it challenging. But I hope by sharing some of our thinking, that might be useful. I'm afraid we're going to have to pause the Q&A here. Thank you to all the kind of people who asked questions. I think we have covered most of the ones that people had put. So thank you again for sharing. In the slides and in the things we've shared in the chat box, we've got a whole section on kind of further information. We have both a blog from NCVO, but also kind of a guidance page, which we're continually updating, and where we are signposting to much of the advice from other organisations as well. I think I would just want to say actually a huge thank you, both to kind of the Chartered Institute, but also many of our other infrastructure colleagues who really have worked rapidly to put out some excellent advice and guidance to support their members, to support our members. Really overnight kind of advice was produced, and I think that's a real testament to those organisations and their willingness to support, which I think is excellent. Finally, us at NCVO, we are here to help and support member organisations, and we're privileged and proud that we support over 17,000 member organisations, from the largest charities in the country down to the kind of small informal groups of people coming together to make their towns and communities a better place. And if you'd like more information about us and about membership, please do click the link in the chat box at ncvo.org.uk/join. Finally, I just want to send, in closing, our best wishes to all our members, to charities and volunteers, thousands of whom will be involved in civic events across the country this week, in local official acts of memorial and tribute, but also in some of the national events happening in London and in national capitals across the United Kingdom. Thank you for all you're doing, and we wish you the best of luck in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you very much to NCVO staff and who've contributed today, and thank you, Dan, for joining us from the Chartered Institute as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good afternoon, and best wishes for the week ahead. Thank you.